Here are men with hands that are calloused, not consecrated. They are used to the burn of ropes, sweat and smells of fish, fraying nets and the squinting worry of work. This time they are the ones who are caught. Though they try to close their eyes like fish, they are lidless, and they are seen. Somehow they are known by this stranger who smells of blood on wood. Joseph Ross's poem beautifully illustrates what the disciples might have been feeling in our gospel passage. They had been through so much together. For 3 years, they left behind everything they knew to follow Jesus. They hung onto his every word, even when they didn't understand what he meant. They somehow knew his words were life and light and truth. But when he told them that he would be killed for his words and actions, they did not believe him. They refused to believe that such a thing could happen, and they promised to be by his side even if it did happen. But when he was arrested, they scattered. Most of them were nowhere to be found as he hung on the cross dying. They ran away in fear that they were next. But then a few days later, miraculously, Jesus was raised to life again and appeared to the two Marys. Then he appeared to the disciples minus Thomas, and then to all of the disciples. Their lives had taken so many twists and turns over the past 3 years, but even more so over the past few days. It's impossible to know what they were thinking, what they were going through, but we can imagine what a roller coaster of emotions it must have been for them. So what do they do? Where do they go from there? Peter says one night, "I'm going fishing." 6 of the disciples join him. It's likely that most of them were fishermen when Jesus first called them to be his disciples. So they go back to what they know. Fishing is simple. They cast out their nets and wait for the catch. It's not mind-bending like resurrection. They know fishing. They understand it. Perhaps these 7 think they will just go back to their simple lives, as if the past 3 years hadn't happened, as if the risen Christ hadn't already appeared to them. But all this had happened. And when they go back to fishing nothing, they catch nothing all night. The same old way all of a sudden doesn't work anymore. And then he appears on the shore. The disciples have no idea who it is. He says to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" "Oh, great, help from a bystander," some of them are probably thinking. But unlike most fishermen who would have created a tall tale about the whale they just caught, they respond honestly and say, "No." Jesus tells them, "Cast the net onto the right side of the boat, and you will find some." Though they might have balked at the supposed stranger's instruction, they do it, and all of a sudden the net is full of fish. It is only then that John realizes that it is Jesus. Once the miracle happens, he knows that it is their Lord. Whenever impulsive Peter hears this, and I love this part, he puts on clothes because he had been nearly naked and jumps into the lake in his clothes and swims to greet Jesus on the shore, sopping wet. Impulsive though he may be, Peter gets it right at this moment. It is time to get out of the boat and dive back into the water to meet Jesus. The safety of his old life will no longer do. In fact, it no longer works for him and the other disciples because they have met the risen Christ. If we're honest with ourselves, most of us are like the disciples. Even after we come to faith, have an encounter with Jesus, or join the church even, we often just go back to our old boats as if nothing is different. This is what many call practical atheism. Regardless of whether someone calls God Lord with their lips, practical atheism is living as if there is no God. How often do we live as if we are not Christians, even as if there is no God at all? Do we go about much of our daily lives as if God does not exist? Do we even give thought to God as we go about our work week or volunteer work or home life? Do the decisions we make at work, do they reflect our Christian values? I'm not talking about who you bake a wedding cake for, and I think Jesus would bake the cake, but big ethical decisions that affect people's lives. Where were the Christians who worked for the pharmaceutical companies that caused the opioid crisis? Where were they when decisions were being made? But it is also about the way we treat our co-workers and colleagues. Do they know we are Christians by our love, or do they think he's just another Bible thumper? Does the way we relate to our spouses and significant others, children and parents, reflect the love and mercy of Jesus? Does it reflect our faith and relationship with God? The problem is not just that we forget about God Monday through Saturday. Restaurant staff say they most dislike working on Sunday because of us. Because of church people. People coming from church are generally known as the worst tippers. We come out of church and we immediately forget that message of generosity. But we don't have to leave the church doors to figure that out. The way we often treat one another shows a lack of charity and hospitality. Does our decision-making as a church body reflect trust in the abundance of God's promises, or is it from a place of fear and scarcity? All this is not to beat us down and say, look how awful we are. No, it is to remind us to live like God actually exists and can and will make a difference in our lives and in this community of faith. Whether we like it or not, everywhere we go, we are ambassadors of Christ. Whether someone is drawn or repelled by the church is ultimately a response to what they see in us. What the gospel passage teaches us this morning is that we can't live our lives the same old way once we know Jesus. If we just go back to fishing in the safety of our boats, we don't receive the blessings of Jesus waiting for us on the shore. And we may find that the same old thing no longer works for us anyway. Once the disciples got to the shore, they hauled all their fish in, 153 in all. It's quite an exact amount for the Bible. Many people have tried to identify what that number could possibly symbolize, some suggesting that it was the number of species of fish at the time, or the number of nationalities and languages in that world. But really, it's about abundance. That God has more than enough love and grace and forgiveness for all of us. It is not in short supply, and it never will be. This story bears a great similarity to when Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes for the 5,000 gathered. In fact, it takes place in the same place as the loaves and fishes. But this time it is an intimate gathering with just his disciples, in fact, not even all of them. And in this resurrection appearance, Jesus simply says, come and have breakfast. It could almost be mundane, but it's not. It's Jesus reassuring the disciples who weren't to be found when he was dying, who scattered and ran away. He's reassuring them that just as there was enough of God's grace to go around in that feeding of the 5,000, there was enough grace for them as well. He takes this morning on the Sea of Galilee to remind the disciples that his grace and mercy and forgiveness is for them as well, to reincorporate them into his body. He uses this simple meal on the seashore to remind them of his love, but also to send them out. Peter would lead the church in Judea, Antioch, and Rome. Thomas would take the gospel all the way to India, where he was martyred. James would share the gospel in the Holy Land and perhaps even as far as Spain. Nathanael went to Armenia, where he converted the king. And John would outlive them all, perhaps even writing the gospel. But from the moment in the boat when they recognized Jesus standing on the shore, they were compelled to live their lives differently. May we be so compelled to get out of the boat ourselves, to meet Jesus on the shore and go out into the world as they did, sharing how Jesus has transformed our very lives. To God be the glory. Amen.